I'm also grateful and excited to have Dr. Solon with us, and I will introduce her after our opening prayer. The North Central Prairie Chaplains is a regional group of the National Association of Catholic Chaplains that has offered annual conferences since 2001. The mission of the group is to provide continuing education and networking opportunities, especially for healthcare chaplains in rural areas of our region. Given the pandemic, we are hosting the conference online for the first time, which we were able to do with the technological and administrative support of the staff at NACC's national office. And I want to thank especially Pamela Jones, Janine Annunziato, and David Lichter for their time, encouragement, and support in making this happen. Offering the conference online has made it accessible to more people. So we have become a national conference this year. And actually, our scope is international. We have a participant from Speyer, Germany. Welcome, Kathleen. This is new territory for many of us, and we are learning the technology as we go along. There may be a few glitches along the way, so please be patient with us. Fortunately, Janine and Dr. Solon have a lot of experience in offering educational and training programs online. The pandemic has made us more socially isolated. Many of us cannot connect in person with our colleagues and our patients or residents, or for that matter, with our own family members and friends because of contact precaution policies or out of our own concern for spreading the virus. Many of us have started providing spiritual care through telephone or Zoom conferencing or running CPE programs online. We see our loved ones only on Zoom or 6 feet apart in our driveways. The committee has tried to find ways to create more personal connections during this virtual conference. One way has been to encourage people from the same local area to meet in small in-person groups using safe social distancing. For example, Dr. Solon and I are here with a small group of chaplains from the Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area at Parker Collins Family Mental Health Center. And I want to thank the center for opening its space up for us. There are several other groups across the country, groups of people who work within the same healthcare system and are able to gather at one of their facilities. A second way has been to invite all of you to create an altar space with a candle. In a few moments during our opening prayer, we will be invited to light our candles across the country and in Germany. May our candles be a reminder that we are together in this virtual space and that all of us are members of the one body of Christ. A third way has been to divide us up into different breakout rooms for small group conversations throughout the conference. Janine and Dr. Solon will direct us on how to join our breakout groups when we come to our first small group conversation. I'd like to thank the other members of the organizing committee for their time and energy and for their creativity, that they have offered to make this conference possible. Lou Cooney Erickson from Minneapolis, Elaine McMillan, and Sherry Braun, both from St. Paul. Lou is here with us at Parker Collins. Nicole Reuter and Marge Wentland are both from St. Cloud, Minnesota, and are with the Center Care Small Group for the next 2 days. If you have any problems with Zoom, send us a message by clicking on the chat icon. And if you have questions for Dr. Solon, you can ask them by either sending a message through the chat feature or by raising your hand. During the Q&A, click on the raised hand icon, and Janine will then unmute your audio, and you can ask your question directly. Among the conference materials Janine sent us, there is a Zoom tip sheet with instructions on how to mute and unmute your audio and to switch to different video options. Recordings of the sessions will be available to those who have registered for the conference. Janine will send out a link to the recordings once she has edited the sessions, and I believe that'll be within 10 days of the conference. Before moving into our opening prayer, I'd like to go over this morning's schedule. First, I want to mention that Janine sent us a schedule of the conference with timetables that include all the time zones in the US. So it might be helpful to refer to that whenever I review parts of the conference schedule. After Nicole leads us in the opening prayer, I will introduce Dr. Solon. Then the first presentation, along with questions, will run for about 90 minutes, taking us to 11:30 Central Time. We will take a 2-hour break for lunch and come back together at 1:30 Central Time for the second session. We were intentional about scheduling a longer break for lunch in order to provide time for those in small groups to eat together and connect. Those of you who are alone at home or at work, I encourage you, if possible, to take some quiet time after lunch to rest or go for a walk, as you might if you were on retreat. At this time, I'd like to invite Nicole Reuter from Center Care Home and Hospice Care in St. Cloud, Minnesota, to guide us in the opening prayer. So Janine, if you would unmute her audio and allow her to share her screen. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Brent noted, my name is Nicole Reuter, and I work as a hospice chaplain here in St. Cloud in central Minnesota. As we begin this morning, I want to first take note of our subject matter for the next couple of days. The impact of adverse childhood experiences, understanding and healing the disconnection from self, others, and God. There is little chance that there is one of us out there who has not been affected by some sort of adverse childhood experience. And as we will learn, these adverse experiences affect our body, mind, and spirit. So as we begin this morning, I invite you to bring a very gentle awareness to your own needs and to the healing and connection you may need from God. We are wounded healers, as Henry Nouwen pointed out. So now I invite you to take a breath and exhale, to unbusy your hands and to be still. Take a moment and close your eyes if you find it helpful to become more present with yourself. Being aware of your body, how your body feels this morning, being aware of your breath. Take a couple more breaths. Remain aware of your inhale and of your exhale. I invite you now to light your candle. We call to mind those who are no longer with us because they have died. Perhaps in this last year. Those who have died within our close circle of family or loved ones. We remember colleagues who have died. We remember those who have recently died from this pandemic. We remember those who have died due to racial injustice. We remember those whose lives were shortened due to the consequences of adverse childhood experiences. We now bring our own intentions and needs at this time, our own need for healing, for comfort, inspiration, direction, connection. Looking at our one candle, we imagine our community as we gather for this conference from all corners of Minnesota, across the United States, as well as across the ocean. As you light your candle, many candles are being lit together. Imagine that for just a moment. Know that we, as the body of Christ, though many parts, are all one body. The light of this candle represents all of our prayers for the blessed memory of those who have passed away, and for our own intentions and needs that we bring. The words of this meditation may be familiar to many of you, taken from St. Patrick's blessing. It reads, "I arise today through the strength of heaven." It begins with a lovely recognition and invocation for God's presence to be a part of every moment of our day. And then the prayer leads us to ask for God's protection. Many of the images in this video portray different ways we as humans can experience trauma, addiction, political unrest and war, aggression toward each other, loneliness, neglect, poverty. These can all have roots in the adverse childhood experiences we will be exploring in these next couple of days. So we lift this all up to the risen Christ who connects and protects. I invite you to experience and pray this blessing with me. Let us pray.
I arise today through the strength of heaven, light of sun, radiance of moon, splendor of fire, speed of lightning, swiftness of wind, depth of the sea, stability of earth, firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's eye to look before me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's way to lie before me, God's shield to protect me from all who shall wish me ill, afar and near, alone and in a multitude. I arise today.
Let us pray. Merciful and loving God, you who created our innermost being in your image and likeness, we thank you for gathering us together today and ask for your blessing upon this time together. Pour your Spirit upon Dr. Phyllis Solon and the wisdom you have granted her as she shares this wisdom with us. Pour your Spirit upon each of us that our ears and heart may hear. May it lead us to better understanding and inspiration in order that we may bring your healing into this world. We ask this through Christ. Amen.
Paul, thank you. That was beautiful, grounding, connecting. I have the pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Phyllis Solon is a licensed psychologist and founding faculty member of the doctoral program in counseling psychology at St. Mary's University of Minnesota. She earned a Doctor of Psychology degree in clinical psychology from the Minnesota School of Professional Psychology. Phyllis is the co-developer of the Adaptive Internal Relational, or AIR, network model for understanding complex PTSD and disassociation and for helping people heal. The approach uses a competency-based, multicultural framework that puts the person rather than the problem at center stage. She has taught doctoral students for over 20 years. Her areas of expertise include clinical work with clients of all ages who have experienced profound trauma and disassociation, families who have adopted transracially or transnationally, individuals with autism spectrum disorders, and persons affected by challenges related to any of those areas. Phyllis provides clinical consultation on trauma, multiculturalism, autism, and many other topics to professionals and organizations. She has designed and taught a wide variety of courses both in the United States and abroad. Phyllis lives in the South Minneapolis area in the same neighborhood where George Floyd was killed. Phyllis sees teaching and learning as taking place within the context of relationships and believes that the highest good is to love, honor, and protect ourselves and others, particularly children and those who cannot protect themselves. She has learned over a long period of time that there is no such thing as self-sufficiency, but we are all intrinsically interdependent. She teaches and practices from the perspective that every interaction has the potential to harm or to heal, and she tries to fall as much on the healing side as possible. I saw Phyllis present on adverse childhood experiences and multi-generational trauma in families and social groups in 2017 at a day-long workshop sponsored by the Minnesota Center for Chemical and Mental Health at the University of Minnesota. I was drawn by her straightforward, frank, but caring personality. And I still remember her colorful and creative PowerPoint presentations, which I think we're gonna see in the next 2 days. And her talk helped me to broaden my understanding of trauma and its impact not only on individuals, but on families and cultural groups. There is a line from Phyllis's website that I love. She writes, "I want my students and clients to grow into being completely and truly who they are meant to be in the world." I was reminded by a colleague last year that Phyllis's vision is also the aim of Chaplains, to help patients and families, staff members, grow into being who they are truly meant to be in the world. We are really fortunate to have Phyllis with us for the next 2 days on this conference topic, the impact of adverse childhood experiences. In this first session, she begins the conference by talking about neurodevelopment. Phyllis, thank you for being with us and sharing with us your insights and professional experiences in working with people living with trauma. Thank you.
Hello, I'm going to move the camera a little bit here because Brent is considerably taller than I am. There we go. All right. I am Irish Catholic on one side and Polish Catholic on the other, and basically come from very short people. Not the Catholic part, the Irish and the Polish part, but funny. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and for being asked to do a conference like this. I'm passionate about this topic and about how we develop the best context in which we develop, as well as what happens when the people who are supposed to be helping us and taking care of us for whatever reasons can't or don't do that. So I am going to go ahead and share my first PowerPoint, and it is the neurology PowerPoint. So that'll be the first one, and ACEs will be what we talk about after lunch. So hopefully y'all be able to find that one. I know there was a little bit of trouble with some people kind of downloading and that kind of stuff. Yep, you got the right one up. So hopefully everyone got what they needed off of the site. And like I think Brent said, that this is going to be recorded and so available to people. One other thing I want to say is that I know that many chaplains are also teachers in teaching hospitals and those kinds of things, and that many of you, many of the people that I've met here in the Twin Cities area are teachers. And I consider the things that I teach to be to be free and available to people to use for your students in whatever way you see fit. If you use any of the handouts that I put together, I just ask that you say where they came from. I believe the more people get this information and have this information, the better. I have many mentors and teachers and heroes that I have used, some of their work, and I've put it together in this package, but I certainly didn't do all the research and take all the pictures of the brains and, do that kind of thing. And so it's what Brent was saying about my beliefs about us being, intricately interrelated. There's no such thing as self-sufficiency. In fact, it's one of the greatest American myths. The myth of self-sufficiency and the myth of meritocracy. So I'm going to share here. There's always 6 buttons I need to push. But I'm pretty good at remembering which ones they are in the right order these days. All right. Okay. One more thing. All right. So if you're having trouble seeing any of the slides, or if you can't hear me, feel free to send a chat message, and we'll figure it out between Janine and I and the other people, Pamela, who are managing the technology. It is, I feel blessed that I have a 21-year-old daughter, and whose name is Zosha, and she's like, it's like you're the kid and I'm the mom, because I know way more about technology than she does. But I've been using the technology, and so felt really grateful that I could lend my expertise in how you put this thing together, and do a training. And so I'm really happy to have the opportunity to be here. So if we start with the neurology of complex and developmental trauma, what I'm going to be talking about is how does the brain develop typically, what's supposed to be happening, and then also what happens when there's traumatic impact. I always start this lecture with this photo, and it's a photo I took when I was teaching in Sri Lanka. I went to Sri Lanka to teach about autism. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who's a psychologist who has a very good friend who's Sri Lankan, and Lynn has a grandson with autism. And so my friend Shannon Schmidt and I were teaching together, and Shannon was going to Sri Lanka. And I said, well, why are you going to Sri Lanka? And she said, because my friend Lynn wants to get a conference going in Sri Lanka to teach about autism. I'm like, Shannon, you don't know anything about autism. She said, I know. I said, I know everything about autism. She said, I know. That's why you should be the one that goes there and teaches about it. And 9 months later, I was in Sri Lanka for a month, and I developed a 40-hour course for pediatricians, social workers, psychologists, and other people. And so I got to also travel. I brought my daughter, who was 9 at the time, and we got to travel, and one of the places we went to was Pinawalawa, which is actually a place for elephants who, baby elephants who get separated, or the adult gets killed, or, so like a refuge. And elephants are amazing creatures. I have something that keeps popping up that I have to keep getting rid of. There we go. And they are extremely gentle and very nurturing towards young. Like other herd animals or community animals, whenever any young animal that's nursing will be nursed by any adult female elephant who has milk. And so it's one of the reasons why they could bring these abandoned, or these babies who are orphaned, to Pinawalawa and get them, and they would be fed and nurtured and taken in and taken care of. So in Sri Lanka, they have like about 8 different kinds of bananas. And I really don't like bananas that you can get here in the United States. And what I found out is, and this was true in Costa Rica too, that nobody in places where bananas grow like those long yellow bananas. And that's why they all come here. Because they don't like them, and they grow all over the place. And so I ate a lot of different kinds of bananas, and they were really amazing. And so I always had this one kind of banana with me. It had kind of a red peel, and you opened it up, and it was kind of a golden color, and it was like a cross between a banana and a mango. Mangoes are my favorite fruit. So I had one of those with me, and we were by these elephants, and there was probably 100 elephants, and I was on a big rock cliff, and one of the people there that like cares for the animals if there's any injuries or anything, they said, well, you can go ahead, because there was 2 adult females and then a baby, and bigger than this baby, and of course this baby is probably about this tall, that's in this picture, but so bigger than this baby, but pretty small as far as elephants go. And he said, you can feed her the banana, but you have to peel it a little bit because they're not very good with their trunks yet. You know, kind of the pincer grass isn't all that great yet. So I peeled the banana. I'm like, oh my God, I get to feed a baby elephant. This is crazy. So I was up on a ledge, and I put up my hand with the banana, and the baby, the little one, started going towards me. And one of the adult females took her trunk, put it around the front of the baby, pulled the baby back. And the other adult female took her trunk, and she smelled the banana, she smelled my hand, she smelled my arm, my head, all the way around me. And then she took her trunk, and she kind of patted the baby on the butt. And the baby came up and took the banana. And this is the example of how mammals at our best, right? In a context of care and love and protection, teach our young how to engage, how to make sure it's safe, right? And there was absolutely no aggression whatsoever. People said, did you feel scared? I'm like, I really didn't feel scared. I felt awe because of my interaction with this amazing creature, or many amazing creatures. So this is what, when we're talking about optimal, and I also call it good enough parenting, this is what we're talking about, is that ability to love and connect and protect, and at the same time connect to community. So protect and be open at the same time. So let's move, and I am not going to, oh, I know why that keeps popping up.
You know, we don't see it.
Okay, perfect. I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide. I just wanted to put it here because I wanted to show you some of the things that I'm going to be talking about, and it's kind of like one of those reference points. I also wanted to put it up because every time we talk about the brain, we have to simplify. We have to like make it so much more simple than it actually is. So everything that I teach you, you just think to yourself, it is 1,000 times more complicated than this. And I could probably go up to maybe 8 to 10 times more complicated than sometimes what I teach. But, you know, other than that, it's beyond me. Most of the articles that I read in, you know, brain science and, you know, all those kinds of neurological articles, whether it's about early child development or those kinds of things, you know, most of them, and I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience reading technical articles, but as I'm reading them, you know, at least 2/3 of the words are like, ew, right? I mean, it's just like, you don't even have the capacity to pronounce them in your head, right? And so it's kind of like I kind of get the idea, and sometimes it's just like I have no clue what that just said. I'm just going to move on. So it's very, very complicated, and I have been studying. Learning and memory parts of the brain since actually high school. When I had my first psychology course at Mother Macaulay Liberal Arts High School. for young Catholic girls. Did somebody else go there? Oh my goodness, somebody in the room here with me went to Mother McCauley High School in Chicago? Yes. What year did you graduate?
79.
Oh my gosh, I graduated in 1980. She graduated in 1979, I graduated in 1980. This is crazy.
Providence. Is that a nursing school?
Yes, yes, Mother Catherine McCauley. Yep. She was, Jean-Baptiste de la Salle is credited with being the first person who taught men in their common language, and Catherine McCauley was the first person who taught girls and brought girls into the educational system who otherwise would not have an opportunity to be educated. So I had a very strong feminist Catholic education, with the importance of each of us in who we are. So I feel very grateful for that. And I went to an Irish Catholic high school, an Irish Catholic grade school, an Irish Catholic high school, and an Irish Catholic college, St. Mary's in Winona. Interestingly enough, I thought everybody liked Catholics. Until I got past college, I didn't even know that people really didn't like us very much, And of course, I know a lot of the reasons why that is systemically and those kinds of things. But so it's kind of an interesting perspective, and we'll talk more about that this afternoon when we're talking more about culture. So it's very complex, and if you don't remember it, you're with 90% of the other people that I talk to, okay? If you've never really learned about the brain, a lot of it's gonna be brand new, and don't worry about it. The more we have anxiety, the less we can actually learn. And so it's what we call the window of optimal arousal for learning, is a little bit of, heightened arousal, but too much arousal, and what happens is, bzzz, right, nothing goes in. And not enough arousal, and that's like teaching after lunch, right? Like everyone's like, too much. So don't worry about it if you don't get it. I'm gonna say some things over and over and over again, and you can decide what of this is gonna be important for you to bring forward. And if you want more, you'll go to more places and learn it. When I was first about 15 years ago, when I was first learning a lot about the brain and impact of trauma, I remember talking to a friend, having a friend of mine who had a lot of information, and I would meet with her once a month, and we would start doing things. And I remember I could feel my neurons growing and connecting to each other. It was like crazy. And I would come back the next time and I'd say, what did you say that thing was? Because I couldn't even keep notes fast enough. And so I guess what I'm saying is I want to invite you into a space of grace, right? That we're going to create this space where I'm going to put information out, and some of it's going to land and stick, and a lot of it's going to just, So don't worry so much about what sticks and what doesn't, but just see what comes up in you. What do you think about? How does it connect? How does it connect to who you are? How does it connect to your own experience? How does it connect to the work that you do and the people that you serve? So I'm going to do, I don't know how many people have ever heard of the hand-brain model. And so this is something that in the circles that I run in a lot of the time, kind of psychology and social work and mental health and that kind of stuff. This is something that we're really quite familiar with. And Dan Siegel is the person that first developed kind of thinking about the brain this way. And so essentially, if you put your hand up and you lay your thumb inside your palm and you put your fingers around the top, this is kind of like a representation of the brain, right? And so this part down here is our spinal cord. Right here is the brain stem at the base of the palm. Your thumb wrapped in is the limbic system. And then when you wrap your fingers around the top, that's this part of the brain right here. And so I'm going to keep, when I talk about the brain every once in a while, I just, my hand just goes up like that. right? Motor memory. And so I invite you, if this is a thing you think that you want to help people learn, I really invite you to do that as I do it, because the more ways that we engage ourselves, our bodies, while we're learning something, the more parts of our brain it gets slotted into. And so do what you need to do. The other thing is, and this is a little easier now for people who are kind of at home and on your own videos and stuff, is it's a little easier to get up and move about the room. But if you need to do that, absolutely, just move as much as you need to. I have worked my whole career in, what's called special education. So I'm pretty used to, there's not many people in the room right now, but I'm pretty used to, like, nothing distracts me, or everything distracts me, and so it doesn't really matter. Do what you need to do. If you need to take a break, take a break. Trust that you're going to learn the things you need to learn to do the work you need to do. So if we think about then the spinal cord and the brainstem down here, we're talking about this area of the brain down here. It's on what we say online at birth. And what does that mean? That means this is the area of the brain that is primary, so that infants can get their needs met and start to understand the world through sensory and body-based information. And so the brainstem here is where arousal starts, and it's the beginning of distress tolerance. So infant meaning making in the first 6 months of life is all rooted in the context of stimulation, calming, attunement, getting your needs met, not getting your needs met, then getting them met, that starts to build distress tolerance, and it's the beginning of emotional regulation. Another part of the brain that is important for how we think about how trauma impacts us is called the reticular activating system. And otherwise, if you're reading articles or stuff, it might be called the RAS, reticular activating system. And so if we think about, again, the brainstem here, the reticular activating system is a bundle of fibers that comes from the spinal cord through the brainstem, and kind of like a shower into the whole entire brain. I need to say something about these photos. All the pictures I have of the brain come from an app called the 3D Brain. You can also find it online, I think it's Cold Springs Lab, and they say on their website and in the app that you can use any of their pictures for any reason to teach about the brain. You just have to say where they come from, and so that's where they come from. And this one I drew on so that you can see these ascending fibers that connect through the spinal cord out to the sensory organs, and they register arousal, right? Distress or arousal. And so basically there's just a continuous stream of impulses coming from all of our sensory organs, both internally and kind of the ones that are outward focused. And they, it just says, wake up. Okay, brain, there's something out there. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. It keeps us in an alert state. So the reticular activating system is about like waking and sleeping and being alert and paying, not necessarily attending to, but orienting to, right? And so we notice something, there's a sound. For instance, if I say, what about the bottom of your feet? Now your reticular activating system, like, connected to the sensory information that you're getting from the bottom of your feet. My guess is a minute and a half ago, you did not feel the bottom of your feet, right? And so my words registered in your reticular activating system to pay attention through a sensory loop to the bottom of your feet. The other thing that the reticular activating system does is it has a way that it habituates to incoming stimuli. And so 5 minutes from now, unless you have issues with the bottom of your feet or your feet in general, you will stop paying attention to that information that's coming in. And it's not that the information isn't coming in anymore. The information is always coming in. It's just that the reticular activating system has said, don't pay attention to that anymore. It's not important for what you're doing, right? So it's the mediation between the inner and the outer world. It has connections then in the other parts of the brain that we're going to be talking about, which is the limbic system and the top of the brain. And it's really important in the stress danger response system. Next is the vagus nerve, and this is really important because it's important for how we learn to calm ourselves and the dissociative response. So the vagus nerve, this is my favorite picture of the vagus nerve I've ever found. I'm always looking online for different kinds of ways, brilliant ways that people show different parts of the brain and the body. And as you can see, so the vagus nerve is one of the cranial nerves, right? And so as you can see here, it has connections with nerve fibers, nerve tracts that go underneath the tongue, at the base of the tongue and in the throat, and then it connects to the lungs and the heart, down into the stomach and the intestines. And the vagus nerve is also on at birth, and it gives information to the infant about everything the infant needs to communicate with the caregiver, right? So what are the things that infants have to communicate about, right? Are they hungry? You know, is there something distressing them? Their lungs they're breathing faster, you know, heart rate's up. They need to eliminate, or they have eliminated, or there's something wrong and they can't eliminate, right? They can't go to the bathroom. So they have to communicate that to the outside world. And in the first week of life, infants start to emit noticeably different sounds depending on what they need. In the first week of life, we know what we need in terms of our internal systems. Think about that, you know? And when infants are attuned to regularly enough, then they continue to know what they need because the need gets met, right? So when infants are hungry and they start to cry, or they start to say, yo, feed me, right? And, you know, the parent is, you know, doing parent things and maybe got some older kids, right? And you're trying to do things and you don't feed them right away and they get a little madder, right? And they have this cry. And so then you come and you're like, oh, you know, oh, baby, let me change your diaper, you know, and the baby's like, no, I'm hungry, right? And you're like, what do you need? And then the 5-year-old is like, well, they're hungry. You're like, how do you know that? You know, because older kids are kind of, you know, they're kind of connected to those different sounds that a baby makes for their different needs. And then we get it as adults over time, you know, we probably catch on. Sometimes we catch on quicker. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. It takes longer for your first child usually. But that idea that we are being trained by the baby as much as we're trying to teach the baby how to be part of the world, the baby's teaching us how to interact with them. And so if we reliably enough meet the baby's needs, then the part of the vagus nerve the ventral vagal nerve that's up in the brain here that connects into the bottom of the brain. The ventral part of the vagus nerve then sends signals back down to the lungs and the heart, right? Turns on the parasympathetic system, rest and digest, right? And so reliable enough needs getting met, rest and digest. And so let's say that, I'm in the kitchen getting lunch ready for, the toddler and the preschooler, and the baby's in the other room and the baby's crying, and I can't get there right away, right? Or I get there and I'm trying to feed the baby and the baby doesn't want to be fed. The baby wants their diaper changed or something else has happened. They got a little, well, it used to be a pin, right? But nobody has pins poking them anymore, right? But so it might be a little bit of Velcro rubbing against them, right? And it's agitating and they're trying to get you to know that and you miss it. But what happens over time is that you get it right, right? Or you get it right enough of the time that the baby starts to develop in the first month of life the ability to know, to predict that even if you don't get it right away, you're most likely going to eventually get it right. It's crazy. First month of life. Babies begin to tolerate some distress because the caregiver enough of the time gets it right. And so the beginnings of like a little agitation, but okay, all right, I know I was hungry last time and she eventually came and she fed me. She got it wrong, I don't know, but it'll be okay, right? And then what happens over time is then the baby, right, like their hand hits their mouth and, right, it's self-soothing, right? The sucking motion, self-soothing. And so we're designed to grow and develop best in connection with caregivers who are loving and kind and doing their best. And sometimes they get it wrong. And in fact, the caregivers need to get it wrong some of the time. Because if they didn't get it wrong some of the time and then repair, there would be no space to start to develop distress tolerance. And so there's a neurology that gets built in systems in the brain that allow us to tolerate distress. And it is these first 6 months of life that lay that neurological groundwork. Cool. So the other thing that can happen, or one of the other things that happen is so the baby's in the other room and they start to cry and you're in the middle of doing something or washing your hands or whatever. And what do? We say, I'm coming, baby. Don't worry, I'm still here. And so we're starting to help the baby know that we're still connected, right? Even though I'm not in the room giving you what you need. And so that's laying down neurology. And when the parent arrives and the parent has a kind, comforting face, sometimes harried, right? And the baby's like, whoa, what's that, But then you feed them and you get happy because we get oxytocin, right? I mean, poof, you get oh, love. I remember when my daughter, who's almost 22, was like 2 weeks old. And I'm just holding her. I'm looking at her. Just like, this is a person, like what? And then I'm like, well, maybe I should put her down and do something else, 20 minutes later, I'm just holding her, just looking at her, It's like that feeling when we connect and the oxytocin flows, right? We get some dopamine flowing, the reward centers in our brain turn on, and then all the social centers of our brain are connected and we are connecting. And so what happens then for the baby is the baby sees that oxytocin glow, right? And we're going to talk a little bit more about mirror neurons, but there's neurons in our brains called mirror neurons. And so that same flow, that same look on the parent's face then gets mirrored inside the baby's brain. And so that smile, that mirroring of the smile of the parent is because of the neurons that we have in our brain. called mirror neurons. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. So what happens if the baby doesn't reliably get soothed? Well, what happens, you can look, Ed Tronick is I think he's a physician, and his research has been in looking at depressed mothers of infants, toddlers, and preschoolers. And what's the impact, the developmental impact for kids that age. And in studying this, he did, and some of you may have seen this, the still face experiment. And if you've never seen it, you can Google it and see it on YouTube or whatever. And what happens is when the mom has a blank face and the baby is interacting, trying to get the mom's attention, what happens, and anybody who has kids or has ever been around kids, you'll recognize this pattern. When the kids want something, first they get cute, right? They're like, oh, they reach out, and they smile, and they babble, and, you know, when they're a little older, they, you know, sidle up to you, and they say, hi, Mom, right? So first, I love you, right? So first they get cute, and then if they don't get their needs met, then they get mad, right? It's like, right? And baby's like, oh, a little, you know, and then they have kind of an angry affect. They might look a little sad, and they have a different kind of vocalization. And if there's still a still face after that, or there's, you know, then what happens is they start to dissociate. And the dissociative response is when there is a numbing response and disengaging from the present moment, because it's too painful to have that still face, and it's a little scary too. And so in Ed Tronic's research, what he shows is that you can, a really connected mom can be with the baby and do a still face. And so this is like, you know, you've got your infant, they're in the high chair, and you're like thinking about, oh, that student that I have to figure out how to help them do whatever, right? And you're just thinking, and you just have the, and so you're not really connected to the baby, and the baby's like getting cute and getting angry, and then, you know, kind of dropping out. Well, if you're usually pretty attentive, and then you like realize and you re-engage, at first the babies might be a little not responsive, but then they pop back, right? And so if we're reliably enough engaged, if we're good enough parents, we see it happen, but then it comes back. And why this is important is because there's been what some people will call debate in the field of psychology since the mid-1800s about whether or not dissociation is real, right? And it's actually a neurological phenomenon, and every single one of us has the capacity to dissociate because we all have a dorsal vagal part. We also have a dorsal part of the vagus nerve. And so in childhood, and in other times in our lives, right, it's a way that our brain says, take a break, you know, like it's bad out there. You know, we might see it as kind of like, you know, the typical end of dissociation is like spacing out, you know, kind of having a haze. Happens to me every time I go to Target. You know, it's like, you know, and then they changed everything around so there's no straight aisles anymore. You know, it's like, capitalism. So anyway, we all have the capacity to dissociate. And I want to say a word about that word. There's two words. One is dissociate and the other is disassociate. And disassociation with the A is when there's something on the outside that you get separated from, right? So you can be disassociated from the Catholic Church, right? Or any other organization or your family or whatever. Dissociation without the A is when there's a separation from yourself on the inside and what's happening currently and presently in the room. And so the way that I think about it is that there's this long continuum, and at one end of the continuum is ways that we all check out sometimes. You know, you work at a new place, you've been there for a year, you worked at the place that you used to work for 15 years. One day you find yourself at the old place that you used to work. Like, crap, right? Because you were just on autopilot, right? We call it autopilot. And you end up taking the other way to the office because you're just doing what you've always done, right? And you're not going to the new place. We call that autopilot. It's just a little dissociative state. You're not really connected to the thing you're doing right now. And it's not a bad thing, it's just a thing, you know? One of my clients a long time ago used to say, it's not a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a thing, right? It's just something that happens. There's also dissociative states that go along with all kinds of medical issues, right? You know, you can have dissociation or feel like depersonalization, derealization, feeling like your body's not your own body when you're profoundly depressed. Or you have Parkinson's or other medical diseases. And so there's a whole continuum of ways that our brain kind of shuts off this connection to what's happening right here in the moment. And a lot of times that happens when the moment is terrifying, right? And so it's a way that we're designed to protect ourselves from terrifying situations. It's a good thing. So it is an adaptive response to terrifying situations. And if you have terrifying situations over and over and over in early childhood, you build a dissociative response that gets hardwired. And so, for instance, if you're 5 years old and there's screaming and yelling and physical abuse in your family, and that happens over and over and over again, the people who are supposed to be taking care of you sometimes aren't taking care of you, and other times are terrifying. And you still have to go to kindergarten and learn how to read. Sometimes what happens is your brain makes a little loop. It makes a little place for you to be the at-home kid where the abuse is happening, and the at-school kid, where your brain is free to learn. Because I've heard this over and over and over and over from people that if you have to experience and think about all those things that are happening at home all the time, you would not be able to learn how to read. It wouldn't happen.
Phyllis, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So someone, Mary Campers asked, who is the researcher that you mentioned who's studying this?
Yep. Ed Tronick, T-R-O-N-I-K, I think it's K. Or it might be C-K, but I think it's K. Ed Tronick. And if you just Google still face experiment, it'll come up. And so he started with looking at depression because sometimes I work with people that nobody was ever trying to hurt them. And mom was depressed during the first year of life. And dad worked a lot. And so they was still face a lot of the time. And so the baby develops a dissociative response for self-protection because not consistently getting your needs met as an infant is actually a life threat, right? If you're a teenager, it's a little different, right? There's a different impact, but not being emotionally connected to as an infant is life-threatening. And so the dissociative response kicks in. And I think that's really important. And we'll talk about this more later, but dissociative disorders like dissociative identity disorder or DID and other dissociative disorders, whether there's a development of parts or not, is more highly correlated with early childhood emotional neglect than early childhood sexual abuse. Dissociative disorders, I'm going to say that again, are more highly correlated with early childhood emotional neglect than emotional abuse. And we're going to talk, than sexual abuse. And we're going to talk about more about why that is as we move into this next phase here. So, so we've got the brainstem, right? And we talked about, right, the brainstem being on, sensory meaning, right? Meaning is in the context of getting your needs met in the relationship. And there's the vagus nerve that goes down into, right, the throat, lungs, heart, stomach, intestines. This is where the gut feeling comes from. It's an actual real thing. It's the vagus nerve. So when you get a gut feeling about something, that's the vagus nerve talking to your brain. And then we have the reticular activating system, you know, that houses the bottom of your feet, right? Now you're paying attention to it again, right? So that says pay attention and then don't pay attention. In some things like autism, one of the things we think that there's some difficulties with is that reticular activating system, because it doesn't have the switch that says stop paying attention to that. And so it's way more complicated than that, but we think that that's one piece of it. And so we've got the brainstem here, and then the thumb, if you think about the thumb, folding in, this whole part of the palm, this is the limbic system. And the limbic system, many people have probably heard about, or maybe you haven't. The limbic system is where we have emotional meaning and memory. All right, and so this turns on by it starts to have increased activity by about 6 or 7 months. And so this part of the brain then, as that turns on, all of a sudden, the infant is still getting their needs, hopefully getting their needs met, and they're having this sensory meaning, but all of a sudden, emotional content gets turned on and gets connected to the people who are meeting your needs, or not, right? And so up until this time, a lot of babies can go to anyone, right? They pass around, and this depends on temperament too. But you know, different people can pick them up, different people can feed them, different people can get them to sleep or jostle them. Around 6 or 7 months, what happens? Yeah, stranger anxiety, right? Because it's like, whoa, you are not my people. Right? No, I'm not going to you. And then the other thing that happens is separation anxiety, right? And a lot of times it gets centered on one particular person. Most of the time that's mom. If you're in a family where, especially if there's breastfeeding, because that's the primary source. And so then other people in the family are like, why won't they come to me? They don't like me. No, it's not about that. It's not about liking you or disliking you. That doesn't happen in infants. Toddlers, yes. And it's passing, so don't worry about it. If they don't like you now, wait 5 minutes. They will love you. Same with middle schoolers. Middle schoolers are essentially toddlers in bigger bodies. So,
teenagers?
Yeah. So then the limbic system is when the attachment process starts. And the attachment process is when we're starting to make meaning in dyadic relationships and understanding. And so this is the beginning of understanding ourselves, understanding others, and understanding the world of relationships and what to expect. And so if we've been reliably attuned to, we come to expect that the world is going to be reliably attuning to us. Oops. What did I do? Sorry. What is happening? Sorry, I'm going crazy here. I don't know why I did this. I know subtitles aren't available. Okay, let me go back here. Where was I? There we go. All right, so the thalamus, you may have heard of. The thalamus sits like right here in this little hollow in our palm, right on top of the brainstem. And it is a hub for sensory and motor information between the brain and the body. And so the reticular activating system says, pay attention. The bundles of fibers that come through the thalamus are given information about what are our limbs doing, where are our limbs in space, are we walking around, you know, so it's coming online, and it has connections then to all the different parts of the brain. It's the gateway between the brainstem and the top of the brain. And that's important for what we're going to talk about in a minute about bottom up and top down processing. And so I'll say that again, so don't worry about it. being a hub for sensory and motor information, we think that a lot of people on the autism spectrum and some other people have what's called synesthesias. And synesthesias are when sensory information wires get crossed. And so if you've ever heard of somebody who hears colors or can feel numbers. So I work with a lot of young people that, they have these sensory experiences that seems to be crossed wires, for lack of a better term, coming through the thalamus. The thalamus also plays a central role in alertness, awareness, and consciousness. And so what happens if, with the impact of repeated childhood trauma, is there's a hyperconnectivity here to what's called the salience network. And the salience network is like pay attention. It's more of the pay attention network. And there's reduced connectivity to other parts of the brain, so that there's a disruption in how the sensory information gets to other parts of the brain. So people may end up being over-reliant on certain sensory input, or over-attending to certain sensory input and under-attending to other sensory input. It's also implicated in negative mood states, and so the impact of trauma on the thalamus is that it shifts the connectivity to the centers of the brain that are alert to negative mood states, or that create negative mood states. There it is, there's my slide, okay. So the amygdala is the next thing I'm gonna talk about. So the thalamus is the gateway. The amygdala is kind of like right here at your thumb. The amygdala orients towards strong emotional cues. That's the job of the amygdala. And what happens is when there's a strong stimulus, so it might be a loud sound, which could have a strong emotional cue to it. And so the amygdala says, pay attention, and then we orient towards wherever the sensory information was coming from. It is involved in the emotional modulation of memory, and it has emotional influences on attention and perception. And so seeing a neutral stimulus as scary or happy or sad has to do with the other memories we have stored down here in the limbic system, right? And the emotional tenor that gets put on some neutral situations. Now, this is not a bad thing. It is just a thing. It is how our brains work, because we have to have a system of recognizing the things that are going on around us. In fact, there is a neurological disorder where every situation is new, every single time. So there's no way for people to, and this can be what happens in autism also, like the brain doesn't form pathways for shortcuts on certain information. And so every time, think about this, every time you get in your car to drive, you have to relearn the rules of the road. Every single time, right? Well, you wouldn't be able to drive, would you? Because everything would be crazy. And so this is kind of what happens sometimes with social relatedness. You have to learn concrete rules because you don't have pathways in your brain that say, oh, when people do this with their face, that means that they're joking, even if the words sound serious, right? And so understanding sarcasm, it's a huge thing for people I work with on the autism spectrum. They don't get it. They're like, but you said this, right? And so they don't have a way to pick up those cues. And we think that a piece of that is about pruning. And so most of us, we have all these connections in our brains when we're little, and starting around 6 months, we start to clip some of them, right? Because we start to notice, oh, these are the people who are my people. This is my dog. You know, we start to orient towards different things over and over and over again. And actually, by a year old, when we're born, every single one of us if we can produce sound, we can produce every sound for every language on the planet when we're born. And in the first year of life, we still can do that, except some of the sounds start to fall off. And so the click sound in certain African languages, most people who aren't from Africa can't make that sound. And it's because we didn't hear it enough, and so it fell out of our ability. Now, if you're really good at producing different sounds, you might be able to, you know, make yourself do that. It's just like you can, people who are really good at accents, right? And then other people who speak Spanish with a rural Wisconsin accent, right? They just never get the ear for it, you know? And so we start to prune things, and what we think, another thing that's going on for people who have autism, the neurology of autism, is that the pruning doesn't happen, and so it's kind of like all possibilities are always possible. And so I remember one time, I love my clients because they keep reminding me what it's like to be them. And I had a young man one time who I'd worked with off and on for many years, and he was in his 20s, and he had just learned how to consistently take the bus from his house to the downtown library. And he told me that he had gotten off the bus because the buses had to change because something happened with the bus, and he was so distressed because he couldn't figure out how to go from there to the place that he always went to. And so he had to turn around and go home, you know? And it's like having a 4 or 5 year old, right? And if you know a 4 or 5 year old or have been around them, if they're telling you a story, do you interrupt them?
Never.
Never, right? Because if you interrupt them, what are they going to do? And they start at the beginning again, and you're like, oh! You know, my sister's a kindergarten teacher. She's like, you never interrupt a 5-year-old. You just don't do it. And so now she's teaching 5-year-olds on a computer. It's insane. She's the Chicago Public School teacher. Anyway, we all know what that's like. Or we don't, and whatever. So this amygdala then, what happens when there's ongoing trauma is that it increases adrenaline a stress hormone is adrenaline and cortisol, and they increase the activity of this part of the brain. And so remember that emotional tenor? And so emotional tenor becomes part of more things. So if you're used to things being scary, more things become scary because the emotional tenor of the amygdala, right, is heightened towards scariness. Does that make sense? And partially that's because of adrenaline, the increased adrenaline that's part of our normal stress response. There's also an increase in norepinephrine that intensifies hypervigilance, and it alters our threat discrimination. And so kind of like I was just talking about, the amygdala changes so that we have a heightened awareness to what may be threatening in the environment. And that's because we live in a very scary environment as children. And so that early childhood trauma changes the brain to pay attention to that. There's also an increased response for people who have early childhood trauma. There's an increased response to fearful memories. And so even as an adult, remembering something that was fearful, if you have a childhood complex trauma, or childhood not with, you know, with the regular traumas that happen in childhood, right? The response to a memory of something scary is much bigger and initiates many more scary memories to be activated than if you don't have a childhood of complex trauma. Does that make sense? Good. Sometimes I'm not sure if all my words are in the right order when I say them so that people can understand them. So if you don't understand something that I've said, please let me know because it's my responsibility to be understandable. There's also a deepening of implicit encoding of fear memories. And what does that mean? That means implicit encoding is the memories that don't feel like memories. And so it's all the spaces in our brains and our bodies that our memories get stored that have to do with sensory and emotional meaning. And there's a decrease to this part of the brain, and we're going to talk about that later. And so in the limbic system, when this turns on, initially, we're still getting implicit sensory and emotional memories laid down in our brains. And so when people say, well, you know, 2 is too young to have a memory, not true. Not true. We have memories. They just don't have words because when you're 2, you don't have words. You have receptive language, but you don't have expressive language because you don't have the left side of your brain, mostly online, that allows you to put conceptual narrative meaning on the things that are happening to you. And so the things that happen to us before we're 3 or 4, depending on when we develop language, because there's a range for that, they get stored in this different way, which is sensory and emotional. For many years, I had this flash of a picture that every once in a while it would just come into my mind and I'd be like, what is that? And it was like a flash, and I can see it right now, of course, of a rug, like a really old rug that was kind of grays and reds and had this flowered pattern on it. And at one point, I asked my dad when I was an adult, I was like, I just don't, I think I was just talking about it. Like, I always have this picture, you know? And my dad said, that was the rug in my mom's apartment. My Irish grandmother died when I was 2, right? So I had no sense of myself in an episode of time. I just had a flash. And guess what you see the most when you're a 2-year-old? Right? What's on the floor? I mean, because that's where you are and that's where you're looking. So, so we really do have memories. Sometimes we call them muscle memories, sometimes we call them body memories, sometimes we call them sensory memories. But it's really important that they are actually memories. We have mirror neurons, and mirror neurons are what give us the capacity to learn by observing and predict the intentions of others. And so when I was talking about the baby, predicting the intention of the caregiver, right? It's like babies are really good at giving you the benefit of the doubt. You know, because if you're reliably there, then you're probably going to be reliably there. They're pretty much in the present moment. And so they predict the intentions of others. They also reflect the affect of other people, like I was saying. So mom has a glow, mom or dad or older sibling has that glow. And then that glow gets actually not just reflected on the face, but the neurons, the mirror neurons, tell the neurons in the baby's brain, in the motor cortex, in the sensory cortex, to fire in the same pattern. So 30% of the neurons that would be firing if the baby was doing the same thing as the parent or the caregiver or the older sibling, 30% of those same neurons are firing. And so our brains are firing in the same patterns as what we're observing. And so actually what we know is that kids who witness physical aggression are more likely to physically aggress than kids who are aggressed against.
You say that again.
Kids who witness physical aggression are more likely to become physically aggressive than kids who are aggressed against. Now, it's confusing because most kids who are aggressed against also witness aggression. And so a piece of that also has to do with temperament, and ways that we're trained as girls and as boys, you know, in our, whether to have aggression turn inward or turn outward, you know, those kinds of things. It's the neurological basis of social learning theory, the development of empathy, which we're going to talk about later, a theory of mind, which we'll talk about later. So the impact of trauma is that the infant and the child come to predict negative or violent intentions of other people. And so this is where you see, you might have a student who always thinks that you're being mean to them, right? My guess is everyone's had a student like that. And a piece of it is, and maybe it's their own response, right? And a piece of that is having a childhood complex trauma in childhood. It shifts our brain to see the small indications that someone is being aggressive. And we all have micro movements all the time. It's like I might think about something that made me mad on the way here, and I'm with a student, and that flashes through my head and maybe comes across my face, and then that student is tuned to that without even knowing that they're tuned to that, right? They're not doing it on purpose. It's an automatic thing. And then they think you're mad at them. And then we do a lot of reassuring, right? Or other temperaments are like, knock it off, right? And we have a lot of ways that we deal with that based on our own childhoods and our own neurology, right? And so, I know this is a lot of information. So how are we doing?
Time for a break.
Good, good. Will you have will you allow for 10, 15 minutes of Q&A at the end? It's 11:02 now.
Right, so, I think what I probably will do is, we can stop in 15 minutes and do Q&A, but I'm probably gonna have to pick up a little bit of it at the beginning of the next one, because it really underlies what I'm gonna be teaching next. But I think that we do need to, and maybe, why don't we just do that right now? Why don't we do a few questions right now? Let me do 5 minutes on this, and then we'll just do questions, and then we'll pick up some stuff after we do a lunch break, okay? I am having taught for many years and being an extemporaneous speaker, I'm Irish and Polish, we tell a lot of stories. And usually, mostly the stories are related, but
Chaplains like stories.
okay, all right, good. And when I think about it, you know, as Catholics, like we are imbued with stories from our birth, right? The myths and the stories and everything that goes into sacraments and going to church. And I grew up going to church every Sunday, every first Friday. We didn't eat meat on Fridays. You know, I mean, like the whole entire thing. And you're laughing because you also went to Mother McCauley, so you grew up on the south side of Chicago too, in an Irish Catholic neighborhood probably. So, so this is the way that we lived. And seriously, there is so much of that is story-based. It's all narrative. And I'm going to talk in the last session about what happens in our brain when we have shared narrative and shared ritual, because it's really cool. And potentially very frightening. So that's when we get cults. So I'm going to just talk about attachment. My guess is you have all heard about attachment. And I just want to talk about in terms of the brain, what's happening for secure attachment, good enough parenting. That's when, you know, according to Ed Tronick, the best, most attuned parents are only perfectly attuned 30% of the time. Good news for parents, right? And well, when you think about it, a 300 batting average is pretty darn good, right? Right? And if you have a 350, you're a star. So it's the attunement, the misattunement, the reparation, you know, that early reparation lays down the neurological groundwork, not only for distress tolerance, but for movement towards repair, right? And so if you grow up with emotional neglect, or like I call it emotional void. So for people who grew up with a depressed or mentally ill parent, and there's just an emotional void, and nobody was trying to abuse them. And so I don't use the word abuse. It was an emotional blank. And so if that happens, then you don't lay in the neurology early on for repair in relationship. But if a parent repairs, then you're also laying in that neurology. The disruption in the reparation increases the complexity and coherence in relational meaning. And so every time there's a disruption and a repair, our brains get more complex. And our understanding of relationship gets more complex. Now this is 6 to 12 months old. So we're not talking about words here. We're laying down sensory and physical neurology and in the emotional centers, meaning in our brains and our bodies for meaning in relationship and what to expect in the world. Parents who attune to their own needs rather than their infant needs at times. People start to develop a connection pattern that is more ambivalent, like little in, little out, little in, little out. Not sure. And what that means is like a parent who, they feed the infant when they're hungry. So they're attuning to their own need rather than the needs of the infant or the child. Another kind of insecure way of learning connection strategies is when parents are dismissive. So this is where we get neglect in relationship. And then there's the disorganized type of attachment where it's like what I was talking about, the dissociation in the face of overwhelming fear, overwhelming terror that is inescapable. This is where you have unreliable extremes of parental behavior. So maybe a parent has a dissociative disorder, or maybe a parent has schizophrenia or profound depression, or sometimes they're there and they're present and they're meeting the needs and being a competent caregiver and compassionate and loving, and other times they're raging. And they don't even have to be raging at the infant. What we know from research that was in the New England Journal of Medicine a number of years ago, in primary care settings, they looked at households where there was verbal aggression between parents. And so nothing towards children, just verbal aggression between parents. In households where there was verbal aggression between parents, 0 to 6 months old, higher level of upper respiratory illness for infants 0 to 6 months old. And so the impact on the stress response systems, and remember, respiratory, what is that? That's that vagus nerve, right? So upper respiratory illness, it affects the immune system, that kind of stress in the environment. And so we have two ways that we're wired to respond to people in the world. And one is to move towards that which is caring, and the other is to move away from that which is terrifying. And so what happens when the same person is both caring and terrifying? It sets up sometimes both those things running at the same time. And so people feel terrified, but they go towards, right? Or people feel the loving and they go away because the neurology is mixed. All right. Whoops. Didn't mean to do that. So I think what I'm going to do, should I unshare my screen or just leave it?
Well, for now, maybe just leave it. Okay. I do have 3 questions here, and then maybe Janine can then open up. So the first question I received was from Deb, and she wanted you to explain again the difference between dissociation and disassociation.
Okay, so disassociation with the A think about it as you associate with other people, right?
That's with the A.
That's with the A.
Okay.
So we are in association with others or groups or that kind of thing. And so when we disassociate, it is separating or being separated from a group or a person on the outside of us. When we dissociate without the A, it is an internal separation. And so we separate ourselves internally from extremely distressing environments outside of us. And so we disconnect from what's happening right around us because it's too terrifying. And I hear people use disassociation in conferences, in psychology conferences. And so people use the words interchangeably, but it's kind of one of those, you know how everyone has a thing, right? That's one of my things. You know, the difference between those two words.
So it's already within us? Within.
Yep, within is dissociation. And so there's separations within us. And then we, as an individual, separate from what's happening in the room. And all of us all the time are responding to things that aren't in the room because our memories in the bottom of our brain are telling us what to expect. And that's just the thing, right? But the more activated and emotional we are, the more the amygdala is in tune. So think about this. Think about a time in the last week or so that you had an argument with somebody you love. Partner, child, grandchild, friend, right? And in that argument, what percentage of what you were feeling had to do with what was actually happening in the room? And what percentage had to do with all kinds of other things? Most people say 10 to 20% had something to do with what was actually happening. And the rest had to do with all kinds of other things. And so and again, it's not a problem. It's just how our brains work. So we know how to respond in the present. The issue comes in when we don't know how much is what we're responding to in the room. And so this is part of why my siblings and I have had the same argument for 50 years, right?
I have about 4 more questions here, Phyllis. So the next person asked, this is Joan, can you give us a definition of trauma? And I don't know, maybe that's something you want to do later, but yeah, so definition of trauma.
According to the APA and the World Health Organization, a trauma is any event that overwhelms the person's ability to respond in the moment. And so when I'm talking about trauma, I'm talking about, you have to think about it developmentally too. So that's like what I was saying when you're 2. A depressed mom is going to have a different impact than if everything's been okay and you're 17 and your mom gets profoundly depressed, right? Because your brain has different critical periods and vulnerabilities for what's going to impact it in what ways. And so a trauma at its simplest is when there is something that happens that overwhelms the system's ability to respond in the moment. And the range of things that I'm talking about is everything from emotional neglect to physical and sexual abuse to medical interventions. So you can have something that's traumatic but not abusive. Right? And so you all see that all the time in hospitals, right? I mean, people are going through traumatic things and nobody's abusing them. It's just what happens. When I was in 5th grade, I broke my collarbone. At the time, the belief was, it seems ridiculous to me now, but at the time the belief was that children did not feel pain as intensely as adults. And they didn't want to give children heavy-duty pain medications for other reasons, right? And so I had a broken collarbone and no pain medication. And I remember holding on to my, one of the good things was I didn't have to wear my uniform at Catholic grade school. But I remember holding on to my pants so that my shoulder wouldn't move, my collarbone wouldn't move. And nobody was trying to abuse me when that happened. But what we know today is, and I got hit by a car outside my house. The car wasn't moving very fast, and I got thrown, fell on my shoulder, had to get surgery for 3 different places in my shoulder. I was terrified of the surgery, which is bizarre because I am not scared of anything. Did I mention I'm Irish? And so I was like, the good news is I have a lot of friends who are psychologists. And so I talked to one of my friends and it's like, oh yeah, I remember this thing. And I was like in so much, and it was right here, right? It's the collarbone I broke, this is, and so all of that came back up and it was like stuck in a bubble for me. And once we talked about that, and I was able to realize, I'm in this time. And that little part of me that got trapped in that time, like self-compassion, bringing that 5th grade part of me, self-compassion, loving kindness, no more fear. Operation was fine. Go ahead.
Thank you. Excuse me. So Ben from Portland asked, I was wondering how neuroplasticity can decrease 30% mirroring habit from a baby that he or she got parents. I was wondering how neuroplasticity can decrease 30% mirroring habit from babies maybe that they got from their parents.
So I think what you're referring to is what I said about
Does the mic pick up the questions? Or can you repeat?
yeah, I think people can hear Brent. It's pretty close because that's the mic right there. Whoever asked that question, if you can clarify it, because I used 30% a few times, and I'm not sure exactly which place it applies. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe Ben, if you could ask your question. I'll move on to another question while Ben's reformulating his. Lizzie asks, aren't all parents loving and terrifying alternately to their little ones, at least incidentally or both?
Yes, absolutely. And so the good news is, again, that our brains are phenomenally elastic. When we fall as parents, much more often on the not terrifying side or the caring, comforting side, we're designed to respond to caring, comforting environments. And so if that's the predominant response of parents, right? And most parents aren't terrifying, right? Like parents can be like scary or like, whoa, what the heck was that, right? But they're not terrifying and overwhelming you regularly in a way that you can't respond.
Ready for another question? This is an interesting one. So I see too many parents with babies staying focused on their smartphones, ignoring their babies' attempts to get attention, or babies looking inattentive. Can this be a problem with babies' development?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the increased intensity in terms of work and those kinds of things also. And the environment, the COVID right now is impacting babies' brains because we're in an environment where adults are stressed all the time, and that's impacting babies due to mirror neurons and their own stress hormones.
So Ben asked again, so he said, I meant firing or mirroring 30%.
Okay, yeah, so what I was saying is that, so for instance, when I do this, right, and I go like this, what do you notice in yourself? Right? One person in the room here actually drank something and I was doing that, because 30% of the neurons in your brain that would regularly fire if you were drinking something are firing in that pattern. Does that make sense? So that's how we learn by watching. That's observational learning. And so when we say, watch how I do this, right? 30% of them, so if I was walking, 100% of my walking neurons are going, right? But 30% of your walking neurons are going. And so visualizing things helps us to learn them, because our brain, when we're visualizing something, starts to fire in those patterns.
Janine asked you to stop sharing the screen.
Oh, yep, I was going to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, there you go. There it is. Here we go.
Well, we have 9 minutes left, and I'm wondering if, there's a question here in the room, and then maybe Janine can open up, or if people have questions they want to ask directly, they can hit the raised hand icon, and Janine will unmute them.
Go ahead.
My question might be a bit premature since we're talking about the lifespan, but I work in a long-term care facility, and we have at least 3 people in our units who have these heart-rending cries for help.
Mm-hmm.
Help me. And when we try to talk to the families, well, we don't know what is going on. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, is this something that is coming from childhood trauma of whatever sort? I mean, they're just heart-rending cries, and we have a hard time redirecting people.
Very likely. And do you work with dementia?
Yes.
Yeah, and so dementia is, as parts of the brain shut down, other parts of the brain just open up. And so these, the ways that memories get stored, and we'll talk a little bit more about this after lunch, it gets encapsulated outside of time. And so it's what we call a trauma loop or a trauma memory. So someone gets, for whatever reason, in there, and then they're looping in that. And so that's when someone, if they don't have dementia, sometimes they can say, I know I'm an adult, but I feel like I'm 5 and my dad is yelling at me, right? And maybe some of us have had that experience, And so that's the difference between the top of the brain and the middle of the brain. And for some people, the nature of the trauma, it encapsulates, and then people are trapped, and they only have available to them the resources that were available at the time that the thing happened. So if you were 3, and it could be that someone was in a bad car accident when they were little, and they got trapped, and they were yelling, help me, and that's what opens up. It also could be other things, all kinds of other things, and likely childhood abuse.
I just need one word. For the thalamus section, you You said it plays a central role in alertness, awareness, and
Consciousness.
consciousness. Thank you.
So, I don't know if anybody's raised their hands. I can't tell. I don't know, Janine, if anybody would like to ask a question directly. Who's
Yeah, I can't see anyone's hands raised.
You can also just do it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah. If you want to turn your cameras back on and you want to just raise your hand, there are 4 pages of cameras. So if you raise your hand, just keep it up and I'll take a look for you.
But isn't there a raise the hand feature on
There
it?
is, but sometimes it's hard to find.
I cannot find it on my screen.
How did you get on the?
We have a question from Joan. I'm going to unmute you.
Okay.
You have to unmute yourself as well, Joan.
Phyllis, I have a question for you. This whole thing about trauma, it seems like our country is currently really going through many, many phases of trauma. So many. And I'm just wondering, is there something about the experience of trauma that makes people want to go back to it? That is that, you know, you're so much just going back to our iPhones and checking out what's the news and what's going on. And it's this sort of self-perpetuating trauma, it seems, that is happening. So that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's 2 different ways of viewing that. One is what I consider a pathology-based view, and the other is what I consider a competency-based view. And so a lot of people, even in the psychological world, I would say probably the majority, say, well, that is, you know, we're drawn towards those things that hurt us, you know, and so in a sense we want to be hurt by those things or whatever. I just don't think that's true, because I don't know anybody that wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, today my plan is to really get hurt. We just don't do that. And so the competency-based way of thinking about that is that actually, as we're doing that, we're seeking safety. Because we're looking for information that's going to tell us we're okay. But what happens is, because the only thing we have to look at is a bunch of the same crap that tells us we're screwed, that we get more and more and more and more hyped. And so I think mostly what people are doing is they're seeking safety.
There's a hand.
Great. Oh, I see a hand. The gentleman with the beanie on and the face mask. You just have to unmute yourself now.
Hi, this is Ben.
Hi, Ben.
Yeah, this is Ben, and I have a question, which I already sent, but you asked for clarification for those 30%. So what can neuroplasticity do to decrease this mirroring, or as you said, firing mirroring habit that babies are learning from parents? And the reason why I'm asking, I have a 6-month baby, so thank you, I'm learning a lot. It's like right time.
Excellent. I think it's important to remember that, you know, according to Ed Tronick, we are only perfectly attuned. The best parents, the most attuned parents, are only perfectly attuned 30% of the time. And so the other 70% of the time, we're either completely misattuned, or, you know, we're like blank, or we're like half attuned, or we're in the kitchen and we're saying, I'm coming, you know, so we're not attuned, but we're connected, right? And so attunement means calming, soothing, meeting the need. But in all kinds of other ways, we're connected. We're just not completely getting it right in the moment because we can't. You know, there's all kinds of other things that are happening. And so it's the connection and the reattunement and realignment that is actually the most important, because it builds the neurology for an infant to start to tolerate not getting your needs met immediately. Because that happens most of our lives, right? And it also then builds, from the mirror neurons, it builds that like the experience, and it's not a belief, because the brain is it doesn't have the capacity to form a belief. It is the physical experience that it'll be okay. So safety in that context might not get there right away, but eventually we'll get through it together. And so I help the folks that I work with to shift from like thinking, oh, safety means nothing bad is going to happen, because that just isn't true. But safety is we'll get through this together. Is that helpful, Ben?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
We have one more question. It looks like down. I'm going to unmute you. The gentleman wearing the headset, you got your hand up. You just have to unmute yourself.
Hello. Yeah, this is Chris from Wisconsin, Racine. Yeah, my question is, it's well understood that you said that infants do have memory, and it grows along with their brain, and except that they don't have words, they don't attach meaning to words. So at what stage do they start building, developing the words or attaching meaning to words? And does it matter the language or any language spoken around them?
So there's two pieces to that, and one is that it seems like, so there's multiple parts of the brain that have to turn on, and we're going to talk about that after the break. But just to directly address the question here is that children by about 6 months, they're starting to receptively understand language. Certain words that are said over and over and over and over and over again. And so they start to respond to all the B words, right? Ball, baby, bottle, bed, right? So they start to understand words, but they don't have the brain capacity yet to put words together on their own to form meaning or narrative. And so they have receptive language, but they don't have expressive language. And so it's around when we start developing language, and the brain develops in the same way across cultures. Meaning is different across cultures. And the patterns of the ways that people connect and attach and take care of their children is different. But attunement and attachment happens the same neurologically across cultures. Once we start to put together language on our own, like kids start with one word, and then a couple of words, right? And those are developmental milestones, 2-word sentences, 3-word sentences. This will tell you something about my daughter. Her first words, I won't. Irish, right? And it's been the same ever since. So does that clarify?
Yeah, it's understood. Yeah.
Good.
So we're at 1:33. I don't know if we should stop or if we have one more question.
I don't see any. Looks like you got a chat.
Do we want to take one more before we break? Or is everyone ready to?
I don't see any more questions.
All right.
Yeah.
So we'll take a break, and we're going to kind of pick up where we left off. And, I've taught for very many years, and I always tell my students the syllabus is a rough estimation of what may or may not happen on any given day. We will get through the information that we need to get through so that, and I believe you will leave here with what you want to leave here with. All right.